In Redemption Creek, winter did not forgive the weak. It tested every soul with hunger, sickness, and fear. But when a silent cowboy saw a desperate mother trying to trade her last treasure for medicine, he made a choice that would change 3 lives forever. What he bought was not just a locket. It was a hidden truth, a buried crime, and the beginning of a fight against a man who believed money mattered more than human dignity. Stay with this tale, because sometimes one act of mercy can start a revolution. If this message reached you, please subscribe for more heartfelt Western stories.
Redemption Creek was a hard place, even in the summer. But the winter was a judge. It looked at what you had and decided if it was enough to keep you alive. Most times, it wasn't. The wind didn't just blow. It bit. It took a piece of you every time you stepped out. I pushed through the door of Hargrove's general store. The bell chimed. It sounded lonely. I didn't go to town for company. I went for oil, salt, a reason to keep breathing. I kept my hat low. My coat was sheepskin, old, heavy, like my heart. Then I saw her, Hannah Miller. She was standing at the counter. She looked like she hadn't slept since the first frost. Her coat was thin, too thin for Montana. She was holding something in her hand. It was small, gold. It caught the light of the oil lamp, a heart-shaped locket. $2, Hargrove said. He didn't look her in the eye. That's the best I can do, Hannah. Gold is fine, but I can't eat it. The quinine is 3, Hannah said. Her voice was steady. But it was the kind of steady that comes from being right on the edge of breaking. And I need the cough syrup for Abby. She's burning up, Mr. Hargrove. Please. Hargrove shook his head. He looked at the floor. I got a business to run. I felt a ghost stir my chest. 8 years I'd been dead inside. 8 years since the fire took Eliza Jane. Since it took the life I was supposed to have. I knew that locket. I'd seen it in my dreams. I'd felt the weight of it in my palm before I ever put it around Eliza's neck in '64. I stepped forward. My boots made a heavy sound on the floorboards. Thump, thump. I'll give you 20 for it, I said. Hannah turned. Her eyes were wide, worn out. She looked at me like I was a specter. Maybe I was. That's too much, she whispered. Not to me, I said. I pulled 2 gold eagles from my pocket. I laid them on the wood. They rang out, a solid sound. I picked up the locket. It was warm from her hand. Hannah reached out, then pulled back. She looked ashamed. She looked like a woman who thought she was losing her soul along with that jewelry. I looked her straight in the eyes. I didn't want her to hide. Ma'am, I said. My voice was raspy. I hadn't used it much lately. Listen to me. Don't look at the floor. There is no dishonor in trading gold for life. A person's dignity isn't found in what they own, but in what they are willing to sacrifice for those they love. You are doing the most honorable thing a mother can do. She blinked. A tear tracked through the dust on her cheek. She didn't sob. She just breathed. Thank you, she said. Mr. Thorne, isn't it? Silas, I said. Abby. She's real sick, Silas. I didn't have anything else. Get the medicine, Hannah, I told her. Get the strong stuff. Get the quinine. Get some beef broth, too. A child's right to health is a higher law than any debt written in a banker's ledger. You make sure she's fed. I didn't wait for her to say more. I couldn't. I walked out into the cold. The air felt like needles. I got to my horse, Silas. He was a buckskin, sturdy. He didn't mind the snow. I climbed into the saddle and rode until the town was just a blur of gray. I stopped by the frozen creek. I pulled the locket out. My hands were shaking. I hadn't shook in years, not even when I was staring down a man with a Colt .45. I pressed the small latch. It clicked. The locket swung open. There she was, Eliza Jane. My Eliza. smiling like the sun was her personal property. I ran my thumb over the glass. My heart didn't just ache, it cracked. Then I saw it. The photo was loose, just a tiny bit. There was a sliver of white paper tucked behind it. I used my pocket knife to pry it out. My breath was coming fast now, mist in the air. I unfolded the paper. It was small, grained with age. The writing was hers, pencil, fading but clear. Silas, it read. I saw Thatcher Sterling by the barn. He doesn't know I heard him. He's coming tonight. He said the land must be clean. He said, you have to go. Please come home. Please. The date at the bottom was September 14, 1870, the night of the fire. I sat there in the Montana silence. The wind howled. I'd spent 8 years hating myself. I'd spent 8 years thinking I was the reason she was gone, because I wasn't home. But Sterling, he'd planned it. He'd murdered her. I looked at the locket. Then I looked back toward the Miller Ranch. Hannah had sold me the truth, and she didn't even know it. I turned my horse. I wasn't going to my ranch. I was going to hers. Truth is a fundamental right, I muttered to the wind. And when a man is robbed of the truth, he is robbed of his life. I've lived in a prison of lies long enough. I spurred the buckskin. We had work to do. The snow didn't stop. It just got thicker, like a blanket of white ash falling over the world. I rode hard. My buckskin, Silas, he knew the way. He didn't like the wind. Neither did I. It hissed through the pines. It sounded like 1,000 secrets being whispered at once. I had that locket in my pocket. It felt heavy, heavier than the gold eagles I'd traded for it. Behind the glass was Eliza Jane. Behind Eliza Jane was a scrap of paper that changed everything. 8 years. I'd spent 8 years believing a lie. I thought I'd failed her. I thought my absence was the match that lit the fire. But it wasn't. It was Thatcher Sterling. The name felt like a burr under a saddle. It rankled. It stung. Sterling didn't just want land. He wanted a clean slate, and he was using the winter to get it. He was using the cold to starve out Goafu like Hannah Miller, just like he'd burned out Eliza. I saw the Miller place through the haze. It was a small cabin, sturdy but lonely. There was no smoke from the chimney. That was a bad sign, a very bad sign. In Montana, smoke is life. No smoke means the fire is out. And if the fire is out in December, death is knocking on the door. I dismounted. My joints popped. The cold does that to a man of 44. I grabbed the sack of supplies from my saddle. It was full. Quinine, beef broth, coffee, a tin of crackers. I walked up to the porch. My boots crunched on the ice. Crunch, crunch. I knocked. No answer. I knocked again, harder this time. Hannah! I shouted it. It's Silas Thorne. I've got the medicine. I heard a movement. Faint, like a bird fluttering in a cage. The door creaked open. Just a crack. Hannah stood there. She was wrapped in a quilt. Her face was pale, grayer than the sky. The fire, she whispered. I can't get it to stay lit. The wood is wet. I didn't ask for permission. I pushed inside. The air in the cabin was cold. It was the kind of cold that settles in your bones and stays there. I saw Abigail, Abby, on the bed in the corner. She was huddled under every blanket they owned. Her breathing was a wet, rattling sound. It cut through me. Get some water, I said. My voice was a command. The clean stuff, from the pitcher. I went to the hearth. It was full of charred, damp pine. I cleared it out with my bare hands. I didn't mind the soot. I found a few dry shavings in a box by the wall. I struck a match. The flame flick was small, weak. I fed it a sliver of wood, then another. Come on, I muttered. Catch! The flame took hold. It grew. I added a bigger log. The heat began to radiate. It wasn't much, but it was a start. I turned to Hannah. She was standing there, holding the water pitcher. Her hands were shaking so bad. The water was sloshing over the rim. "Sit down, Hannah," I said. I took the pitcher from her. "I'll handle the medicine. You just sit." I mixed the quinine. I followed the instructions the doctor had given me years ago. I'd seen a lot of sickness in the war. I'd seen it as a marshal. You learn things. You learn that fear kills faster than the fever if you let it. I walked over to the bed. Abby's eyes were closed. Her skin was hot to the touch. Too hot. "Abby," I said softly, "open up, little bit. This is the stuff that makes the rattling stop." She opened her eyes. They were brown, big, like a doe's. She looked at me, and for a second, I saw the child Eliza and I never got to have. It was a sharp pain, a fresh one. She took the medicine. She coughed, a hard, racking sound that shook her small frame. Then she lay back down. "Is the cowboy going to stay?" she asked. Her voice was a thread. "For a while," I said, "until you're warm." I went back to the stove. I started the beef broth. The smell filled the room. It was the smell of hope. Hannah was sitting in a rocking chair near the fire. She looked at me like I was a puzzle she couldn't solve. "Why, Silas?" she asked. "You don't know us. You paid a fortune for that locket. And now you are here, burning your wood and feeding our mouths. Why?" I stirred the broth. The steam rose up, clouding my vision. I thought about the note in my pocket. I thought about Sterling, but mostly, I thought about the world I wanted to live in. "Stranger is just a word for a neighbor you haven't helped yet," I said. I looked her right in the eyes. I wanted her to hear the weight of what I was saying. On the frontier, we don't survive by the gun. We survive because we don't let our neighbors face the dark alone. A child's right to health is a higher law than any debt written in a banker's ledger. You make sure she's fed, Hannah, because every person on this territory has a right to be cared for, no matter how much gold they got in their pocket. Hannah leaned back. She didn't say anything for a long time. The only sound was the crackle of the fire and Abby's labored breathing. "Sterling says the opposite," she said finally. "He says the weak are just fuel for the strong. He says this land doesn't have room for people who can't pay their way." "Well, Sterling is a man who counts his worth in silver," I said. "He's forgotten how to count in heartbeats. But a man's value isn't decided by his bank account. It's decided by his integrity, by how he treats the folks who can't do a lick for him in return. That's the real law of the land, not the one he writes in his books." I poured a bowl of broth. I handed it to her. "Drink this," I said. "You're no good to her if you're hollowed out." She took it. She drank. I saw the color start to return to her cheeks. It wasn't much, but it was enough to see the woman she was before the world tried to break her. She was handsome, strong-jawed, the kind of woman who could hold a homestead together with nothing but grit and a prayer. I spent the next 3 hours working. I chopped more wood from the pile out back. It was frozen, but my axe was sharp. I stacked it high by the door. I fetched more water. I checked Abby's fever every half hour. It started to break around midnight. The sweat broke out on her forehead. Her breathing slowed. It wasn't perfect, but the rattle was gone. She fell into a real sleep, the kind that heals. Hannah was asleep in the chair. She looked peaceful. I sat on the floor by the hearth. I pulled the locket out again. I looked at Eliza's face. I felt a presence. I looked up. Abby was awake. She was watching me from the bed. "Is that your girl?" she whispered. "She was," I said. "She's pretty." "She was the best of us, Abby." Abby looked at the locket, then at me. "Do you have a secret, Cowboy?" I froze. "Kids, they see through things. They see the shadows you try to hide." "Everyone's got secrets, little bit," I said. "Some are like stones. They just weigh you down. Others are like seeds. They're waiting for the right time to grow. Is yours a seed? I looked at the note tucked behind Eliza's picture. I thought about the justice I'd been running from. I thought about the badge I'd thrown in the dirt 8 years ago. I think it might be, I said. I think it's about time I started planting it. Abby nodded. She seemed satisfied with that. She closed her eyes and drifted back off. The night wore on. The wind outside died down to a moan. I sat there in the warmth I'd built. I felt something I hadn't felt in a long, long time. I felt a purpose. I looked at Hannah, sleeping in the chair. I looked at the little girl who was going to live to see the sun come up. Compassion isn't a weakness, I said to the empty room. It's the only thing that separates us from the wolves. If we lose the ability to care for each other, we lose the right to call ourselves a civilization. A man who stands by while his neighbor suffers is a man who's already dead inside. I wasn't dead anymore. Sterling had tried to kill me by taking Eliza. He'd tried to kill me by letting me drown in my own guilt. But he'd made a mistake. He'd let that Locket get away. And he'd underestimated the strength of a mother who'd sell everything for her child. I stood up. I quieted my movements. I put a final log on the fire. It would last until dawn. I walked to the door. I looked back one last time. I'll be back tomorrow, Hannah, I whispered. She didn't wake up, but she shifted in her sleep. She looked warmer. I stepped out into the night. The stars were out now. They were cold, distant, but they were bright. I climbed onto Silas. We headed back toward my ranch, but I wasn't just going home to hide. I was going home to prepare. I had a secret. I had a letter, and I had a reason to fight. Justice isn't just about punishing the bad, I told the buckskin. It's about protecting the good. It's about ensuring that a Goafu and her child can sleep without fear of the shadows. And as long as I'm drawing breath, Sterling isn't going to take another soul from this creek. The ride back was long. The cold was still there, but it didn't feel so heavy. I had a fire in my belly now, a different kind of fire. I thought about the locket. It was back where it belonged, near the heart of a man who remembered what it meant to be a marshal. Redemption Creek was a hard place, but it was about to get a whole lot harder for Thatcher Sterling. I looked at the horizon. The first hint of blue was touching the edges of the world. The judge was coming, and this time he was bringing the truth. The sun came up slow that morning, like it didn't want to see what was happening on the ground. It was a pale, weak light. It turned the snow to a dull silver. I rode into my own ranch, the Thorn Place, just as the frost was starting to sparkle. 8 years I'd lived here, 8 years of silence. The house was a shell. I'd kept the windows clean, but I hadn't let the light in. Not really. I'd spent my days counting cows and my nights counting regrets. I went inside. The air smelled of cold ash and old wood. I didn't take off my coat. I sat at the kitchen table, the same table where I'd sat with Eliza Jane 1,000 times. I pulled that scrap of paper out of my pocket, the letter from the Locket. I read it again. Sterling, he's coming tonight. Every word felt like a punch. I'd blamed myself for being on the trail that night. I'd blamed the wind. I'd blamed God. But the truth was simpler and much uglier. It was a man with a pen and a plan. I looked at the cupboard in the corner. There was a small drawer at the bottom. I hadn't opened it since 1870. I pulled it. It creaked, resisting. Inside was a leather pouch. I opened it and felt the cold weight of the star, my U.S. Marshal's badge. It was tarnished. The silver was dark. I rubbed it with my thumb. I thought about what it meant. I thought about the oath I'd taken. And I thought about why I'd walked away. I thought I lost the right to wear you, I whispered to the empty room. I thought I'd failed the only person who mattered, so I figured I couldn't protect anyone else. I sat there for a long time. The house started to warm up as the sun climbed, but I stayed cold. I was realizing something I should have known a decade ago. Silence isn't a shelter, I said, my voice echoing off the bare walls. It's a grave we dig for ourselves while we're still breathing. I thought by keeping quiet and staying out here, I was keeping the peace. But all I was doing was letting the weeds grow. When a man knows the truth and holds his tongue, he's just as guilty as the one who told the lie. Truth is a fundamental right, and keeping it hidden is a crime against every soul in this territory. I stood up. I pinned that dark star to my inner vest. Not on the outside. Not yet. But I needed to feel it against my ribs. I needed to remember who I was before I decided I was nobody. I packed a small bag, dried meat, more coffee, and a box of .45 cartridges. I wasn't going to sit in a cold house anymore. I had a debt to pay, not to the bank, to the truth. I rode back to the Miller place. The trail was easier now. The wind had died down. I saw Hannah outside. She was hauling water. Her movements were slow, but she was doing it. She saw me coming and stopped. She wiped her brow with the back of her hand. "You're back," she said. It wasn't a question. It was a relief. "I said I would be," I replied. I dismounted and took the bucket from her. "Abby's sitting up," Hannah told me. "She's asking for those crackers you brought. She says the cowboy has the good kind." I followed her inside. The cabin was warm now. The fire I'd built was still humming along. Abby looked better. Her eyes were bright. She was pale, but the ghost of a smile was there. "You came back," Abby said. "I forgot my manners," I said, handing her the tin of crackers. "And I figured you might need someone to keep an eye on your mama. She's a hard worker, but she don't know when to sit." Hannah laughed. It was a dry, rusty sound, like a gate that hadn't been opened in years. She sat at the table and watched me. She saw the change in me, I could tell. She saw that the shadow in my eyes had moved. "You found something, didn't you?" she asked. "In that locket." I sat down across from her. I looked at Abby, then back to Hannah. "I found a letter," I said, "from my wife, written the night she died." Hannah gasped. Her hand went to her throat. "After all this time?" "After all this time," I said. I leaned forward. "There is a weight to the truth, Hannah. Most folks think it's light because it's the right thing. But truth is heavy. It demands things of you. It demands that you stand up when it's easier to sit. And I've been sitting for 8 years. I've been letting a man like Thatcher Sterling run this valley because I was too broken to see he was the one who broke me." I told her what was in the note. I told her about the fire. I saw the fear in her eyes, but I saw something else too, anger, a good, clean anger. "He did that to you," she whispered, "and now he's trying to do it to me. He wants this land, Silas. He sent a man out here last month, offered me pennies, said it was an act of charity, because a widow shouldn't be burdened with a homestead." "Charity," I spat. "Sterling wouldn't know charity if it bit him. He wants the silver under your feet, and he's willing to let a child freeze to get it." Hannah looked at Abby. She gripped the edge of the table. "What do we do? He's the bank. He's the law in town. Everyone owes him something." I reached into my vest and pulled out the pouch. I laid the tarnished star on the table. Abby leaned forward. "A star," she whispered. "It's an old star," I said, "but it still points the same way. The law isn't a person, Hannah. It isn't Thatcher Sterling. The law is a promise we make to each other. A promise that we'll be fair, that we'll protect those who can't protect themselves. When the law becomes a tool for the greedy, it isn't the law anymore. It's just a club, And it's our job to take that club away from them. Hannah looked at the badge. She looked at me. You're going to fight him. I'm going to do my job, I said. I'm going to ensure that the truth is heard. Sterling thinks he can bury people. He thinks he buried Eliza Jane. He thinks he can bury you. But the truth is like a bone. You can bury it deep, but it don't rot. It just waits for someone to trip over it. I spent the afternoon helping Hannah. I fixed the door frame that had been warping. I checked the horses. I talked to Abby. She told me about her father, James. How he'd worked himself to the bone. How he'd always told her that the land was theirs, no matter what the men in suits said. He was right, I told her. Property isn't just dirt and grass, Abby. It's the sweat and the dreams you put into it. Every person has a right to the fruits of their own labor. To take that away through trickery or force isn't just stealing. It's an assault on a person's dignity. You hold on to this place. Not because it's land, but because it's yours. Abby nodded. She took it in. She was a smart girl. Too smart for the life Sterling was trying to force on her. As the sun began to set, the air turned sharp again. I stood on the porch with Hannah. We looked out toward town. The lights of Redemption Creek were starting to twinkle in the distance. It looked peaceful from here. It was a lie. He'll be coming, Hannah said. The 30 days are almost up. He said he'd be here personally to help me move if I didn't sign the papers. Let him come, I said. I'll be here, and I won't be in the shadows. Why are you doing this, Silas? Really? I looked at her. The wind caught her hair. She was a woman who had lost almost everything, and she was still standing. Because I forgot that I was part of a world, I said. I thought I could just be an island. But a man who stands by while his neighbor is wronged is a man who's lost his soul. Human rights aren't something given to us by a bank or a government. They're born in us. The right to be safe, the right to be heard, the right to live without fear. If I don't fight for your rights, I've got no claim to my own. Hannah reached out and touched my arm. Her hand was warm. Thank you, Silas. Don't thank me yet, I said. The truth is a loud thing, and once it starts talking, it don't stop until the air is clear. It's going to get noisy around here. I walked back to the barn to bed Silas down. I felt the star against my chest. It felt right. It felt like I was finally waking up from a long, cold sleep. I thought about Sterling. He was probably sitting in his fine house, drinking expensive whiskey, thinking he'd won. He thought he'd silenced the world. He was wrong. The locket was open, the letter was read, and the cowboy he'd tried to destroy was back. Honesty is the only currency that matters in the end, I whispered to my horse. Sterling thinks silver is power, but silver tarnishes. A man's word and the truth he carries, those are the only things that last. And I'm going to make sure he pays every cent he owes this town. I looked up at the stars. They were bright tonight. They didn't look lonely anymore. They looked like witnesses. The trial of Redemption Creek was beginning, and I was the one bringing the evidence. The frost on the windows was thick that morning. It looked like ferns made of ice. I stood by the stove, watching the coffee pot. The blue enameled metal was chipped. It had seen better days. Just like the woman sleeping in the chair. Just like me. I'd spent the early hours out in the barn. I checked the horses. I sharpened my skinning knife. I checked the action on my Winchester. Everything was ready. But the hardest part wasn't the gear. It was the waiting. Waiting is a slow poison. It gives your mind too much room to wander. It makes you think about things you'd rather forget, like the smell of smoke in 70, or the way a man looks when he realizes he's lost everything. Hannah woke up just as the coffee started to hiss. She sat up straight. Her eyes were sharp. She was a mother. She didn't have the luxury of a slow wake-up. "Is it time?" she asked. "Not yet," I said. I poured her a cup. "But soon. A man like Sterling don't wait for the heat of the day. He likes the morning. He thinks the cold makes people more agreeable to a bad deal." She took the mug. The steam rose up between us. "What if he brings the sheriff, Silas?" "He might," I said, "but a badge don't change the truth. Every human being has a right to be treated with fairness, Hannah. It don't matter if a man wears a star or a suit. Power is a temporary thing, but justice is supposed to be permanent. If the law is being used to steal from a widow, then it's not the law anymore. It's just a crime with a fancy name." She nodded. She drank her coffee. We didn't say much more. We just listened to the house. The wood groaned in the cold. Abby stirred in the bed, dreaming of crackers and horses. Around 10 o'clock, I heard it. The sound of a carriage. It wasn't a working wagon. It was a fine rig. Polished wood, spoke wheels that didn't rattle. Sterling's carriage. "He's here," I said. I didn't go out right away. I let him sit in the cold for a minute. I wanted him to feel the Montana winter. I wanted him to remember that this land wasn't his office. It was a place that broke men who didn't respect it. I stepped out onto the porch. Hannah was right behind me. Sterling was sitting in the carriage, wrapped in a heavy fur coat. Beside him was a man in a black suit, tall, thin. He looked like a crow perched on a fence. Wendell Cross, Sterling's lawyer. Sterling climbed down. He moved slow. He had a smile on his face that didn't reach his eyes. It was a merchant's smile. "Mrs. Miller," he said, tipping his hat. "I trust you're finding the morning invigorating." "It's cold, Mr. Sterling," Hannah said, "which I think you knew." Sterling chuckled. He looked at me. He squinted. He didn't recognize me. Not yet. I was just a ranch hand to him, a ghost in a sheepskin coat. "And who might this be?" he asked. "A friend," I said. My voice was low, like the rumble of distant thunder. Cross stepped forward. He had a stack of papers in his hand. They looked crisp, white, out of place against the mud and snow. "Mrs. Miller," Cross said. His voice was high, nasal, as we discussed. "The 30-day grace period on the loan extension for the Miller homestead has expired. Per the contract signed by your late husband, James Miller, the bank is exercising its right to call the full balance of the mortgage, $340. Hannah looked at the papers. She looked like she wanted to vomit. "You know I don't have that, Mr. Cross. James was paying. He never missed a month until the accident." "A contract is a contract, Mrs. Miller," Sterling said. He sounded sympathetic. It was a performance. I truly wish it were different. But the bank has investors. We have a duty to the community to maintain our fiscal integrity. If you can't pay, I have a buyer ready. I'm willing to give you $20 for the move, out of the goodness of my heart. I felt the badge against my ribs. It felt hot. "Goodness of your heart," I said. I stepped down off the porch. I stood between Sterling and the carriage. Sterling narrowed his eyes. "Excuse me?" "You heard me," I said. "You're talking about integrity, Mr. Sterling. But integrity isn't about following the fine print in a way that leaves a child in the snow. Integrity is about the spirit of the promise. James Miller didn't sign that paper so you could wait for him to die and then snatch his daughter's future. To use a person's misfortune to line your own pockets is an act of cowardice, not business." Cross bristled. "Who do you think you are?" "This is a legal matter. It's a human matter," I replied. "Every person has a right to their own labor. James Miller put 5 years of his life into this dirt. He built that fence. He raised that barn. To take all that effort and trade it for $20 and a pat on the back is a violation of a man's right to his own life's work. Equality means that a Goa Fu's homestead is just as sacred as a banker's mansion. You don't get to decide whose home matters more. Sterling's face turned a shade of red that matched the trim on his carriage. I don't know who you are, but you're overstepping. This land is bank property. Is it? I reached into my vest. I pulled out the tarnished star. I didn't pin it on. I just held it up in the winter light. Sterling froze. His eyes went from the star to my face. He studied me. He looked at my jaw, my eyes. Thorne, he whispered. Silas Thorne, you're dead. You died in the fire. The fire took a lot of things, Thatcher, I said, but it didn't take me, and it didn't take the truth. I found the locket. I found the letter. The color drained from Sterling's face. He looked at the lawyer, cross, looked confused. He didn't know about the fire. He just knew about the land. I don't know what you're talking about, Sterling said. His voice was shaking. That's ancient history. This is a debt, a legal debt. A debt built on a foundation of lies is no debt at all, I said. A contract signed in good faith is a sacred thing, but a contract used as a trap is a weapon. The law is a promise we make to one another to stay civilized. When you turn that promise into a cage for the vulnerable, you've broken the social contract. You're not a businessman anymore, Thatcher. You're just a thief with a better vocabulary. I stepped closer to him. He retreated toward the carriage. He was a small man without his desk. You have no standing here, Thorne, Sterling hissed. You're a disgraced lawman. You haven't worn that star in 8 years. You're a squatter on your own ranch. Maybe, I said, but I'm a witness. And I'm a neighbor. And in this territory, that counts for something. I've sent a letter to the territorial marshal in Helena. I've told him about the locket. I've told him about the fire, and I've told him about your sudden interest in the silver veins under the Miller place. Sterling's eyes went wide. He looked at Cross. Cross was already stepping back toward the carriage. Lawyers are like rats. They know when the ship is starting to take on water. This isn't over, Sterling said. He climbed back into the carriage. He didn't look at Hannah. He didn't look at me. You can't prove anything. The fire was an accident. Then why are you running? I asked. The carriage pulled away. It moved fast. The wheels threw up slush and mud. I stood there until the sound of the hooves died away. Hannah came down off the porch. She was shaking. Not from the cold, from the adrenaline. You did it, she whispered. He's gone. He's gone for now, I said. I put the badge back in my pocket. But bullies don't just disappear, Hannah. They regroup. They find a new way to tilt the scales. We have to be ready. Because the right to live in peace is something you have to defend every single day. It ain't a one-time fight. I went back to the barn. I needed to work. I needed the rhythm of it. I spent the afternoon hauling hay and checking the water troughs. I thought about Sterling. He was scared. That made him dangerous. A scared man with money is like a wounded wolf. He'll bite anything that gets close. Abby came out to the barn later. She was wearing a thick wool hat. She looked like a little owl. Did the bad man leave? She asked. He left, I said. I sat down on a hay bale. Will he come back? I looked at her. I didn't want to lie. Maybe, Abby. There are folks in this world who think that being big gives them the right to take from folks who are small. They think that because they have more, they are worth more. But they're wrong. Every person, no matter how small, has a right to stand their ground. We just have to make sure we stand together. Abby nodded. She picked up a piece of straw. My daddy said that. He said a bundle of sticks is harder to break than one. Your daddy was a smart man, I said. I looked at the barn door. The sun was starting to dip. It cast long, orange shadows across the snow. I felt the weight of the secret I was carrying. The letter from Eliza Jane. It wasn't just about land anymore. It was about a debt that was 8 years overdue. I'd spent so long thinking I was a failure because I couldn't protect Eliza. I'd let that guilt eat me alive. But standing there, facing Sterling, I realized that the guilt was just another tool he'd used. He'd let me blame myself, so I wouldn't blame him. Self-respect is a human right, too, I muttered to the horses. The right to forgive yourself, the right to move forward. Sterling tried to take that from me. He tried to make me believe I was less than a man. But a man is defined by his actions in the present, not the shadows of his past. I walked back to the house. The windows were glowing orange. Hannah was in the kitchen. The smell of frying salt pork and potatoes wafted out. It was a humble smell, a beautiful smell. I stopped on the porch. I looked at the locket, which I'd given back to Hannah. She was wearing it now. It wasn't just a piece of jewelry. It was a beacon. It had traveled through the dark to find me. It had brought the truth home. "Dinner's ready, Silas," Hannah called. "Coming," I said. I stepped inside. The warmth of the room hit me. It felt like a promise. Ting tung zu ngui wei ngui, compassion between people, is the only thing that keeps the frost from winning, I thought as I sat down. We're all just trying to make it to the spring, and we only get there if we help each other over the drifts. I looked at Hannah. I looked at Abby. The cowboy had a secret. But he also had a family now, even if he hadn't realized it yet. And I wasn't going to let anyone take that away. Not again. Honesty is the only foundation worth building on, I told myself. And the truth is, I'm not leaving this ranch. Not until the air in Redemption Creek is clean enough for a child to breathe. I picked up my fork. The battle was just beginning. But for the first time in 8 years, I knew I was on the right side of the line. The morning after Sterling's carriage rattled away was quiet. Too quiet. In Montana, that kind of silence usually means a storm is brewing. But it wasn't the sky I was worried about. It was the man in the velvet vest. Sterling was a man who didn't like being told no, especially by a ghost. I woke up before the sun. I'd spent the night in the barn. It felt more natural than the house. I liked the smell of the hay. I liked the slow, rhythmic breathing of the horses. It reminded me that the world keeps turning, even when you think it's stopped. I walked out into the yard. The air was crisp. It felt like breathing in crushed glass. I saw the corral fence. It was leaning. James had done his best, but the frost had heaved the posts. I grabbed my post hole digger and a heavy crowbar. Work is a medicine. It's a different kind than the stuff in a bottle. It clears the head. It gives the hands something to do besides shaking. I was 3 posts in when I heard the cabin door creak. Abby stepped out. She was bundled up in a thick wool coat that was 3 sizes too big. She looked like a little bundle of gray wool. She walked over to me, her boots crunching on the crusty snow. "You're making it straight," she said. She was watching me align the new post. "Got to be straight, Abby," I said. I stopped to wipe my brow. A fence that's crooked won't hold, not when the cows get restless. She sat down on a stump. She watched me for a long time. She was a curious soul. She didn't just look, she observed. "Is that why you came back?" she asked. "To make things straight?" I looked at her. Kids have a way of hitting the nail right on the head. In a way, little bit. In a way. I walked over to where my horse, Silas, was tied. He was watching us with his big, intelligent eyes. I grabbed a stiff brush from my saddlebag. "Come here, Abby," I said. "I want to show you something." She hopped off the stump and came over. She looked a little nervous. Silas was a big animal. To a child, he must have looked like a mountain. "He won't bite?" she asked. "Not a chance. He's got a heart as big as this valley. But you have to treat him right." I handed her the brush. "I want you to brush his shoulder, just like this. Long, steady strokes." She took the brush. Her hand was small against the buckskin's coat. She started to brush. Silas leaned into it. He let out a long, contented sigh. "He likes it," Abby whispered. "He does," I said. I sat down on my haunches so I was eye level with her. This was important. "Listen to me, Abby. Treating a horse right isn't about making him do what you want. It's about earning his trust. Respecting a creature that can't speak for itself is the first step toward being a person worth knowing. If you can't respect the animal that works for you, you'll never truly respect the people who live beside you. Every living thing has a right to be treated with kindness, not just because it's useful, but because it's alive." Abby nodded. She kept brushing. She was careful. She was intentional. I think Daddy knew that. He never hit the mules, even when they were stubborn. "Your daddy was a wise man," I said. "He knew that Ton Chunk Kon Ngui, respecting people, starts with respecting life in all its forms. A man who is cruel to his stock is usually a man with a hollow soul." We spent an hour out there, me fixing the fence, her grooming the horse. It was peaceful. It was the kind of morning that makes you forget about bankers and lawyers. Around noon, Hannah came out. She was carrying a tray with 2 bowls of hot stew and some thick slices of bread. She looked better. There was color in her face. The medicine was working for Abby, but the hope was working for Hannah. "I figured the workers needed fuel," she said, setting the tray on the flat top of a fence post. We sat down in the sun. The stew was rich. It tasted of venison and wild onions. It was the best thing I'd eaten in 8 years. "The town is talking." "Silas," Hannah said. She was leaning against the corral rail. "I saw Ruth Calloway this morning. She rode up to check on Abby. She said the news about you being back, it's spreading like a grass fire." "I figured it would," I said. "Sterling won't keep it quiet. He'll try to paint me as a madman or a liar." "Ruth doesn't think so," Hannah replied. "She remembers you. She remembers Eliza Jane. She said people are starting to ask questions haven't asked in a long time. About the fires. About the land deals." I chewed my bread. I thought about the people of Redemption Creek. I'd served them once. I'd protected them. Then I'd vanished. I'd left them to Sterling. "I owe them an apology," I said. Hannah looked at me, surprised. "For what? You lost everything." "I lost my way," I replied. "A man's worth ain't found in his solitude." "Hannah, it's found in his connections." I thought I could just be an island. I thought I could hide away and the world would just stop. But a man who turns his back on his community is failing a basic duty. We have a right to be part of something bigger than ourselves. Tonchong Kongui, respecting people, means recognizing that their struggle is just as real as your own, and that you have a responsibility to stand with them when the wind gets cold. Hannah reached out. She placed her hand over mine. It was a simple gesture, but it felt like a bridge. "You're standing now, Silas," she said. "That's what matters." We sat there for a while, just breathing. The sun felt warm on my back. It was a strange feeling, happiness. I'd forgotten what it felt like. It's a quiet thing. It doesn't shout. It just settles. After lunch, I went back to the corral. I worked until my muscles screamed. I liked the ache. It felt honest. As the sun began to set, the sky turned a deep bruised purple. The shadows stretched out across the snow, long and thin. I walked back toward the house. Abby was on the porch. playing with a small wooden horse James had carved for her. "Silas?" she called out. "Yeah, Abby? Are you going to stay for dinner?" I looked at the cabin. The smoke was rising, straight up from the chimney. The windows were glowing with orange light. It looked like a home. "If your mama has enough stew, I reckon I might," I said. Dinner was quiet, but it wasn't the heavy silence I was used to. It was a shared quiet, a comfortable one. We talked about small things, the weather, the horses, the way the owls sounded at night. After Abby went to bed, Hannah and I sat by the fire. The flames danced in the grate, casting flickering shadows on the walls. "I looked at the locket again today," Hannah said. She reached up and touched the gold heart hanging from her neck. "I thought about Eliza Jane. I thought about how she must have felt writing that note. She wasn't just trying to save her land, was she?" "No," I said. I looked into the fire. "She was trying to save me. She knew I'd blame myself. She knew I'd go into the dark if I didn't have the truth. She was protecting my right to know. The truth isn't just a fact, Hannah. It's a form of respect. When you lie to someone, you're saying they aren't worth the reality. You're taking away their right to make their own choices. Honesty is the only foundation worth building on, because without it, you're just building on sand." Hannah nodded. She looked into the embers. "Sterling built on sand. He built a whole empire on it." "And the tide is coming in," I said. I stood up. I needed to get back to the barn. I didn't want to overstay. I didn't want to crowd her. "Silas," Hannah said as I reached the door. "Yeah? Thank you. For today. For the fence. For Abby." "No need," I said. It was a good day. A real good day. I walked out into the night. The stars were out in force. They looked like diamonds scattered on black velvet. I breathed in the cold air. It didn't bite so hard tonight. I got to the barn and bedded down. I pulled my blankets tight. I thought about the fence. It was straight now. It was solid. Building a life is a lot like building a corral, I thought as I drifted off. You have to set the posts deep. You have to make sure they're straight. And you have to remember that the point isn't just to keep things in. It's to keep the things you love safe. Every person has a right to feel secure in their own home. And I'm going to make sure that post is set so deep, no one can ever shake it again. I closed my eyes. For the first time in 8 years, I didn't dream of fire. I dreamed of a straight fence. I dreamed of a little girl brushing a horse. I dreamed of a future that didn't have a secret at the center of it. The bond was forming, not just between me and Hannah, not just between me and Abby, but between me and the man I used to be, the man who cared, the man who fought. The cowboy had a secret, but the marshal had a mission, and the mission was just beginning. "Human dignity is the only thing worth more than gold," I muttered into the darkness. And it's about time someone reminded Thatcher Sterling of that fact. I slept hard. I slept deep, and when I woke up, the sun was already touching the peaks. It was a new day, and the work was waiting. The wind changed on Wednesday. It didn't come from the north anymore. It shifted to the east. That's a dry wind, a restless wind. It rattled the loose shingles on the barn roof, like a gambler shuffling a deck of cards. I was up on a ladder. I was hammering down the cedar shakes James had cut before he passed. He'd done good work. Straight grains, even thickness. He'd built this place to last for 100 years. It was a shame he didn't get to see the second one. Hannah was on the ground. She was holding the base of the ladder. Her hands were steady. She looked up at me, squinting against the glare of the snow. "You're a handy man to have around, Silas Thorne," she said. "A roof is a promise, Hannah," I replied. I pounded in another nail. Clack, clack. It's a promise to the folks inside that the world can't get to them. If the roof holds, the home holds. I climbed down. My knees felt the climb. I took a cup of coffee from her. We stood there, looking at the horizon. It was a beautiful view. The valley stretched out, white and gold, but I didn't see the beauty. I saw the gaps in the trees. I saw the places where a man could hide. "You're looking for them," Hannah said. It wasn't a question. "They're coming," I said. Sterling didn't go back to town to lick his wounds. He went back to sharpen his teeth. Men like him don't believe in losing. They believe in making the cost of winning too high for anyone else to pay. I took a sip of the coffee. It was hot, bitter, good. "Hannah," I said. I looked at her. I wanted her to hear this. Every person born into this world has a right to live in peace. It ain't a gift. It ain't something a banker grants you when your mortgage is paid. It's a natural right, same as the air you breathe. When someone tries to use fear to take that peace away, they aren't just breaking a law, they're attacking your very soul. We got a right to be safe in our own yards, and we got a right to stand together against anyone who says otherwise. She nodded. She reached out and touched the gold locket around her neck. "I spent so long being afraid, Silas. After James died, the fear was like a second shadow. I thought it was just part of being a go-afu. I thought I had to earn my safety by being quiet." "That's what they want you to think," I said. "Fear is the tool of the tyrant. They use it to make the world feel small. They want you to believe you're alone, so you'll be easier to break. But the truth is, equality means we all share the same burden of protecting each other. If I don't stand up for your right to be safe, then my own safety don't mean a lick." We went back to work. We spent the afternoon hauling wood. We were preparing for a siege. We didn't say it, but we both knew. Around 4 o'clock, they showed up. It wasn't Sterling. It was his messengers. 3 of them. They weren't wearing suits. They were wearing trail-worn duster coats and hats pulled low. They rode up to the gate, but didn't come in. They just sat there, on their horses. Watching, I stepped out onto the porch. I didn't bring the Winchester. Not yet. I just stood there, my hands hanging loose at my sides. Hannah stood in the doorway, her hand on Abby's shoulder. "You lost?" I called out. The man in the middle spat a stream of tobacco juice into the snow. It left a dark, ugly stain. "Just looking," he said. His voice was gravelly, unkind. "Mr. Sterling wanted to make sure the missus was doing all right. He's worried about the fire risk out here. Late in the season, dry wind. It was a threat, plain as a pikestaff." "The fire risk is low," I said, "as long as folks stay on their own side of the fence." The man laughed. "It was a cold sound. Fences can be cut, Thorne, and ghosts can be buried a second time. You might want to remember that before you get too comfortable." They turned their horses and rode off. They didn't gallop. They walked. It was a slow, arrogant exit. They wanted us to know they weren't afraid. Hannah stepped out onto the porch. Her face was set, hard. "They're going to burn us out, Silas," she whispered, "just like they did to Eliza." I felt the old fire in my gut, the one that had been cold for 8 years. It was white hot now. "Not this time," I said. I walked down to the gate. I looked at the tracks they'd left in the snow. They were deep, heavy horses. I spent the next 2 hours setting up. I moved the horses to the back corral, closer to the house. I hauled extra buckets of water and set them by the doors. I checked the perimeter. As the sun went down, the wind picked up. It howled through the eaves. It felt like the valley was screaming. I sat on the porch with my Winchester across my lap. Hannah came out with a plate of bread and cheese. She sat down beside me. "Silas?" she asked. "Johanna? Why is he so greedy? He has everything. He has the bank. He has the biggest house in town. Why does he need this dirt? I looked out into the dark. Greed isn't about needing, Hannah. It's about power. Men like Sterling don't see people. They see obstacles. They think that because they have money, they have a right to dictate how everyone else lives. But they're wrong. Human dignity is a right that no amount of gold can buy. Every person, from the highest judge to the lowest ranch hand, has a right to be treated with respect. Sterling thinks he's an architect of the world, but all he is an architect of fear. And fear only works if you agree to be afraid. I'm not agreeing anymore, Hannah said. Her voice was thin, but it was sharp, like a knife. Good, I said. Around midnight I saw it, an orange glow. It wasn't at the house. It was at the far end of the property, near the old hay rick James had built by the north pasture. Stay here, I told Hannah. I ran. I didn't take the horse. I wanted to be quiet. My lungs burned in the cold air. I reached the rick just as the flames were starting to climb. It was a warning fire. A look what we can do fire. I used a shovel to throw snow on the base. I worked fast. My heart was thumping like a drum. I managed to knock it down before it caught the main stack. I stood there in the dark, smelling the smoke. It was the same smell as 1870. It made my vision blur. It made my hands shake. I heard a twig snap. I spun around. My rifle was up. I was looking down the sights at a shadow. Don't shoot. It was the deputy, Tom Birch. He was standing by a pine tree, his hands up. He looked young, scared. What are you doing out here, Birch? I hissed. I saw them leave town, he said. He was breathing hard. Hurst. I mean, Sterling. He told them to send a message. I couldn't stop them, Silas. He's got my father's notes. If I cross him, my family loses everything. I lowered the rifle. But I didn't move closer. So you just watched? I asked. I followed them, Birch said. I wanted to make sure they didn't hurt the child. Silas, you have to leave. He's calling in the territorial sheriff. He's going to claim you're an imposter, a squatter. I looked at the smoking hay. Listen to me, Tom. A badge is a weight, not a shield. You have a duty to the truth, not to the man who signs your paycheck. Every person in this valley has a right to an honest lawman. If you let a criminal run the law, then there is no law. You're young, but you got to decide right now who you serve. Do you serve the man with the gold, or do you serve the people who have a right to be protected? Equality means the law applies to Sterling just as much as it applies to a drifter. Birch looked down at the snow. He looked like he was about to cry. I don't know what to do. You do what's right, I said. You go back to town. You keep your ears open, and you remember that the truth is the only thing that's going to set you free from Sterling's thumb. Birch nodded. He turned and vanished into the trees. I walked back to the house. I was tired. I was angry, but I was steady. Hannah was waiting for me on the porch. She saw the soot on my face. She saw the look in my eyes. The hay? She asked. Just a bit of it, I said. They're trying to rattle us. I sat down on the steps. I felt the weight of the years. But I also felt a strange kind of peace. Courage isn't the absence of fear, Hannah, I said. I looked up at the stars. It's the realization that something else is more important. The right to live with honor. The right to look your daughter in the eye and know you didn't bow to a bully. We're standing up for more than just a ranch. We're standing up for the idea that every person matters, that no one is lesser just because they don't have a title or a bank account. Hannah sat down beside me. She leaned her head on my shoulder. It was a small gesture, but it felt like the most important thing in the world. I'm glad you're here, Silas, she whispered. I'm glad I'm here too, I said. We sat there for a long time. The wind died down. The valley went silent. It was a beautiful cold night. I thought about the letter in my pocket. I thought about the locket. Honesty is a slow harvest, I thought, but it's the only one that sustains you. Sterling can burn the hay. He can cut the fences, but he can't burn the truth. And he can't cut the bond between people who decide to be brave together. As the first hint of gray touched the sky, I stood up. "Go get some sleep, Hannah," I said. "I'll take the morning watch. Will you be okay?" "I'll be fine," I said. "I've got the sun coming up, and I've got a reason to see it." I watched her go inside. I watched the smoke rise from the chimney. I felt the star against my ribs. It felt like it was starting to shine. "The right to a future is something we build with our own hands," I muttered to the morning. "And I'm going to make sure Abby Miller has the brightest one I can give her." I sat on the porch and watched the light grow. It was a new day, and the architects of fear were about to find out that some foundations are built on rock. The cowboy had a secret, but the marshal was finding his voice, and the voice was getting louder. Justice is coming, I thought, and it's bringing the spring with it. I checked the action on my Winchester. The battle was joined, and I wasn't going anywhere. The snow was blue in the early light, like ink on a page that hadn't been written on yet. I sat on the porch steps, watching the world wake up. My breath was a steady cloud in the air. My Winchester was leaning against my knee. It felt cold, honest. Inside the cabin, I heard the soft clink of a coffee pot. Then the murmur of voices, Hannah and Abby, the sounds of a life trying to hold itself together. It's a fragile thing, a home. You don't realize how much it weighs until someone tries to take it from you. Abby came out first. She was wearing her thick wool hat again. She had a small wooden box in her arms. It was an old cigar box, polished smooth by small hands. She sat down beside me on the step. She didn't say anything for a long time. She just looked out at the trees. "My daddy had a secret, too," she said finally. Her voice was small, like the chirp of a winter bird. I looked at her. I didn't push. "Secrets are heavy for a little girl to carry, Abby. He told me to keep this safe," she said. She opened the box. Inside were some smooth stones, a bird feather, and a sealed envelope. The paper was yellowed. It had a name written on the front in a strong, slanted hand. Hannah. He said to give it to Mama if he didn't come back from the high pasture, Abby whispered, but I was scared. I thought if I didn't give it to her, he might still come back. Like the letter was the thing that made him gone. I felt a pang in my chest. "Listen to me, Abby. Children have a right to be children. You shouldn't have to carry the weight of grown-up worries. It's the job of the adults to protect your peace, and it's a failure of the world when you have to hide things to keep your heart from breaking. Every child has a right to a life free from fear and secrets." Abby looked at the envelope. She handed it to me. "I think it's time, because you're here, and you aren't scared of the banker." Hannah stepped out onto the porch then. She saw the envelope in my hand. She saw the box. She turned as white as the frost on the rails. "James," she whispered. We went inside. The fire was roaring now. It felt warm, but the air was thick. I handed the letter to Hannah. She sat at the table, her hands shaking so hard she had to pin them against the wood. She tore it open. I watched her face. I saw her eyes move back and forth. I saw her catch her breath. Then she started to cry. Not a loud cry, a silent, gut-wrenching sob that shook her whole body. "Read it, Silas," she said, pushing the paper toward me. I picked it up. James Miller's voice came off that page like a ghost stepping into the room. "Hannah, it started. If you're reading this, I've run out of time." I found something in Silas Webb's old trunk, a letter from Sarah Colt. Silas Webb was the only one she trusted. She knew Sterling was coming for them in 1870. She knew why. Sterling is after the silver. Hannah. He's been killing to keep the secret. He killed the Moors. I think he's going to come for me next. If I don't make it, find Silas Thorne. He's a marshal. He's the only one who can stop this. I put the paper down. My heart was thumping against the star in my vest. He knew, I whispered. James knew I was alive. He was looking for me. He was trying to protect us, Hannah said. She wiped her eyes. Her voice was gaining a new kind of steel. James believed that every person has a right to the truth of their own history. He died because he wouldn't let Sterling bury the past. Justice isn't just about the living, Silas. It's about honoring the lives that were stolen. Those people, Sarah, William Moore, my James, they have a right to have their stories told correctly. A society that lets its dead be forgotten in lies is a society that has no soul. I stood up. I felt the weight of my duty. It wasn't just about a ranch anymore. It was about a debt that had been growing interest for 8 years. We need to see Agnes Moore, I said. Abigail stayed with the neighbor woman, Mrs. Gable. Hannah and I rode into town. We didn't go the main way. We took the back trails. I didn't want Sterling's men seeing us before we were ready. Agnes Moore lived in a small house near the edge of the creek. She was old. Her hands were gnarled like cedar roots. She sat in a rocking chair on her porch, wrapped in a heavy shawl. She watched us ride up with eyes that had seen too much. Silas Thorne, she said. She didn't sound surprised. I figured you'd be along. The wind has been smelling of old smoke lately. We sat with her. I told her what I knew. I showed her the letter from James. Agnes listened in silence. When I was done, she looked out at the creek. William saw them, she said. Her voice was steady. The night your house burned, Silas, he saw Dale Sutton and another man carrying kerosene. He saw Sterling's carriage waiting at the crossroads. He wanted to go to the law. But Sterling came to the forge. He told William that accidents happen to families. He looked at our boys. William stayed quiet to keep us alive. Then he died in that accident at the forge a month later. She looked at me, and her eyes were fierce. I've lived in silence for 8 years, Silas, but silence is a prison. Every human being has an inherent right to speak the truth without fearing for their life. When a man like Sterling can buy a person's tongue with threats, there is no such thing as freedom. We have a right to be heard, and we have a right to be safe from the people who hold the purse strings. My husband was an honest man, and he deserves to have the world know how he truly left it. Will you testify, Agnes? I asked. In front of a judge? I've got one foot in the grave already, she said. I'd like to keep the other one on Sterling's neck until the law arrives. I'll say it. I'll say it to the devil himself if I have to. As we rode away from Agnes's house, the sun was high. It was a cold, bright noon. I felt a change in the air. The secret wasn't a stone anymore. It was a lever, and we were starting to push. He's going to find out, Silas, Hannah said. We were skirting the edge of town, staying in the shadows of the pines. He'll know we're talking to people. Let him know, I said. Truth is like water, Hannah. You can dam it up for a while, but it'll always find a way through the cracks. And once it starts flowing, no man, not even Thatcher Sterling, is big enough to stop the flood. Equality means that a banker's secret is no more powerful than a widow's word. We are taking back the right to our own lives today. We were almost back to the Miller Ranch when I saw the rider. It was Tom Birch, the deputy. He was waiting for us at the fork in the road. He looked tired. His horse was lathered. "They're coming for you, Silas," Birch said. He didn't look at Hannah. He looked at me. "Sterling found out about the letter you sent to Helena. He's filed a warrant. He's claiming you stole that locket. He's claiming you're harassing Mrs. Miller." I looked at Birch. I looked at the young man caught between his conscience and his fear. "Tom, you're standing at a crossroads," I said. I pulled my horse closer to his. "Every citizen has a right to a lawman who serves the people, not the highest bidder. If you serve a warrant you know is built on a lie, you aren't a deputy anymore. You're just a servant of greed. You have a right to be a man of honor, but you have to choose it. Sterling doesn't own your soul unless you hand it to him. Do you want to be remembered as the man who helped a killer, or the man who helped the truth come home?" Birch looked at the badge on his own chest. He looked at Hannah. He looked back at me. "He's got my father's notes, Silas. If I don't serve this, my father goes to jail for a debt he didn't pay. Your father would rather be in jail than have a son who sold his integrity," I said. "Dignity isn't something you can buy back once you've traded it away. You have a right to stand tall, Tom. Don't let a man like Sterling take that from you." Birch sat there for a long time. The only sound was the wind in the needles. Then he reached out and took the warrant from his pocket. He tore it in half. "I didn't see you," he said. His voice was shaking, but it was clear. "I'm going to Billings. I'm going to find Dale Sutton. I heard he's drinking himself to death in a saloon there. Maybe he's ready to talk." "Good man, Tom," I said. He turned his horse and galloped away. He was riding hard, riding like he was trying to outrun his own shadows. Hannah and I rode the rest of the way in silence. We got back to the ranch just as the sun was starting to dip. The shadows were long. They looked like fingers reaching across the snow. I saw Sterling's men sitting on the ridge. They were watching, just watching. I stepped onto the porch and looked up at them. I didn't hide the Winchester this time. I held it across my chest. "The longest night is coming, Hannah," I said. "But we have the light now. And no matter how much dark he throws at us, he can't take the truth back. Every person has a right to be free from the weight of other people's crimes. We are standing on the rock now, and we aren't moving." Hannah stood beside me. She reached out and took my hand. "We're ready," she said. I looked at the locket around her neck. I thought about Sarah Colt. I thought about James Miller. Honesty is a debt that must be paid, I thought. And Thatcher Sterling's bill is coming due. The cowboy had a secret. But the truth was out, and it was the most dangerous thing in the valley. I watched the men on the ridge. I waited for the dark. "Justice is a human right," I muttered to the wind. "And I'm going to make sure it finds its way to Redemption Creek." The battle was moving from the shadows into the light, and I was the one holding the torch. The darkness that night was thick. It wasn't just the absence of light. It was a weight. It sat on the roof of the Miller cabin like a heavy, cold hand. The wind had died down to a whisper, but it was the kind of whisper that makes the hair on your neck stand up. I sat on the porch, wrapped in my sheepskin. The Winchester was a cold bar of steel across my knees. I spent a lot of years in the dark, in Wyoming, in the territories. I knew how to read the shadows. I knew when the silence was a lie, and tonight the silence was screaming. Hannah came out around midnight. She didn't have a lamp. She moved like a ghost. She sat down on the bench beside me. We didn't talk for a while. We just listened to the creek freezing over. "They're out there," she whispered. "I know," I said. I saw a glow of a cigarette about 300 yards out, near the old willow line. Just one, a little orange eye watching us. Then it vanished. "Silas," Hannah said, Her voice was steady, but I could feel the tension coming off her, like heat from a stove. What if the law doesn't come? What if the territorial marshal thinks we're just trouble? I looked at the spot where the cigarette had been. Listen to me, Hannah. Every human being has a right to be safe from intimidation. It's a basic part of being alive. When a man like Sterling uses the night to try and steal your peace, he's trying to take more than your land. He's trying to take your humanity. But a person's right to stand their ground doesn't depend on a marshal in Helena. It depends on the truth they carry. We are standing here because it's our right to be here, and no amount of shadows can change that. She leaned back against the cabin logs. I used to think being brave meant not being scared, but I'm terrified, Silas. I'm scared for Abby. I'm scared for you. Being brave is just doing what's right while your knees are shaking, I said. Abby has a right to grow up in a world where her home is a sanctuary, not a target. Our job, the job of every adult, is to protect the psychological safety of the children. If we let the bullies win tonight, we aren't just losing a ranch. We're telling her that fear is the ruler of the world, and a child has an absolute right to believe in justice. We sat there for another hour. Then I heard the sound of hooves. Not a gallop, a walk. 3 riders came out of the tree line. They stopped just at the edge of the porch's reach. The moon was high now, casting a pale, sickly light on their dusters. In the middle was Thatcher Sterling. He wasn't in his carriage. He was on a tall, black horse. He looked different in the moonlight, less like a banker, more like a wolf. "Thorn," he called out. His voice was loud. Too loud for the night. "I hear you, Thatcher," I said. I didn't stand up. I stayed seated, relaxed. It's a trick I learned a long time ago. If you look like you aren't worried, it makes the other man think you know something he doesn't. Sterling rode a few steps closer. His men stayed back, their hands near their holsters. "I've come to offer you a way out, Silas," Sterling said. "I'm a reasonable man. I don't want any more blood on this dirt than is strictly necessary." "Is that right?" I asked. "And what's the price of your reason tonight?" Sterling leaned forward on his pommel. $500. Cash. In a pouch on my saddle. You take Hannah and the girl, and you ride out. You head west. You don't look back. You leave the Locket. You leave the letters. And you forget you ever heard the name Redemption Creek. I felt Hannah stiffen beside me. $500 was a fortune in 1878. It was enough to start over in Oregon. Enough to buy 1,000 acres of new dreams. "That's a lot of money for a legal debt, Thatcher," I said. "It's an investment in silence," Sterling replied. "Consider it a gift, for old time's sake." I stood up then. Slowly, I let the Winchester catch the moonlight. "Thatcher, there are things in this world that don't have a price tag. Integrity is one of them. Every man has a right to be treated with honesty, but he also has a duty to be honest himself. If I took your money, I'd be selling the lives of the people you killed. I'd be selling James Miller's soul. A person's life has an intrinsic value that no banker can ever calculate. To trade the truth for comfort is to surrender your own dignity. And I've spent too long without mine to sell it back to you for $500. Sterling's face twisted. The mask of the respectable businessman finally fell away. He looked ugly, cruel. "You're a fool, Thorne," he hissed. "You're a dead man holding a piece of paper. You think the people in town will back you? They're scared. They owe me. They'll watch this place burn, and they'll turn their heads just like they did in '70. Maybe they will," I said. "But every person has a right to a second chance. The people of this town have a right to redeem themselves. They've lived under your thumb. because they thought they were alone. But once the truth starts talking, it's a hard thing to ignore. Equality means that my word is just as good as yours in a court of law, Thatcher. And I'm going to make sure that court hears every syllable of what you've done. Sterling pulled his horse back. There won't be a court. There will just be a fire. And this time, there won't be any survivors to write letters. He turned his horse. You have until dawn, Thorn. When the sun hits that ridge, my patience is gone. They rode back into the shadows. I watched them go. My heart was thumping, but it was a steady beat, like a clock. Hannah was standing now. She was looking at the ridge. He's going to do it, Silas. He's going to burn it all. He's going to try, I said. I looked at her. I saw the fear, but I also saw the fire. Hannah, listen to me. We are doing something bigger than just keeping a house. We are asserting the right to live without fear. That is a fundamental human right. No one, not a banker, not a king, has the authority to tell you that your life is worth less than their profit. We are standing for the dignity of every person who has ever been pushed around by a bully. And that is a cause worth any risk. We went back inside. We didn't sleep. We spent the rest of the night preparing. I moved the heavy oak table against the front door. I checked the windows. I placed the buckets of water in the center of the room. Abby woke up around 4. She saw us moving. She saw the look on our faces. She didn't cry. She just went to the corner and grabbed her wooden horse. Is the banker coming back? She asked. I went over to her. I knelt down so we were eye to eye. Abby, I want you to remember something. You have a right to be brave. You have a right to expect the adults in your life to do what is right. We are fighting tonight so that you never have to hide a secret in a cigar box ever again. Every child has a right to the truth, and every child has a right to a future that isn't bought with lies. You stay with your mama. You trust us, Abby nodded. She hugged her mama's waist. The hours crawled. The dark outside turned to a bruised purple, then a dull gray. The ridge was starting to show against the sky. I stood at the window, the Winchester ready. My eyes were stinging from the lack of sleep, but my mind was clear. I felt the star against my chest. It felt like it was humming. I thought about Eliza Jane. I thought about the 8 years I'd wasted. I thought about the Locket. The right to a legacy is something we earn, I thought. It's not just what we leave behind. It's how we defend what was left for us. Eliza left me the truth. James left Hannah this land, and we have a right to pass that on to Abby without any blood on the title. I saw the first sliver of gold touch the top of the ridge. It was time. I saw movement in the trees. Not 3 riders this time. 6. They were spread out in a line. They were carrying torches. They weren't lit yet, but they would be soon. I turned to Hannah. It's starting. She picked up the old shotgun James had used for wolves. She checked the shells. She looked at me. We are standing for the right to be here, she said. Her voice was like stone. Yes, we are, I said. And remember, Hannah, justice isn't just about the ending. It's about the standing. The very act of refusing to bow is a victory for human dignity. No matter what happens in the next hour, we have already won because we refuse to be victims. Every person has the right to say no to evil, and we're saying it loud today. I turned back to the window. The riders were moving now. They were coming down the slope. They were lighting the torches. The orange flames looked like angry sparks against the cold morning sky. I sighted the Winchester on the lead rider. My finger was on the trigger. The threshold was crossed. The shadows were gone. The right to life and liberty isn't a suggestion, I whispered to the barrel. It's a command, and I'm the one enforcing it today. I took a breath. I held it. The cowboy had a secret. But the marshal was about to make a statement, and the first shot was going to be heard all the way to Helena. For the truth, I thought. I squeezed the trigger. The crack of the Winchester was a sharp, dry sound. It bit into the morning air. It didn't sound like much, just a pop. But it did the job. The lead rider's horse bucked. The torch flew from the man's hand. It landed in the slush, hissing as it died. The line of riders faltered. They weren't expecting a fight. They were expecting a guava foo and a child to be huddled under a bed. They weren't expecting a dead man with a star in his pocket to be staring them down through a peep sight. "That's far enough," I shouted. My voice sounded like it was coming from the bottom of a well. Deep, cold. Thatcher Sterling was in the back. He didn't have a torch. He had a cigar. He didn't look worried. Not yet. He raised his hand. His men stopped. "Thorne!" Sterling called out. "You're just making this harder on everyone. 1 man against 6? Those aren't odds. That's a suicide note." I didn't answer. I just cycled the lever. Clack, clack. The sound was loud in the silence. It's a sound that tells a man his life is about to change. Hannah was at the other window. She had the shotgun. She looked at me. Her eyes were hard, like flint. She was ready. "Listen to me, Hannah," I said. I didn't look away from the sights. The right to self-defense is a fundamental human right. It's the right to say that your life matters, that your daughter's life matters. When the people who are supposed to protect the law become the ones who break it, the law returns to the hands of the people. We aren't being violent. We are being righteous. And there is a world of difference between the two. Hannah nodded. "I know, Silas. I'm not defending dirt. I'm defending her." The riders started to move again. Not all at once. They were trying to flank the house. Sterling was smart. He knew I couldn't watch every window. "I'm going to tell you one more time." "Thatcher," I yelled. "The territorial marshal has the letters. The deputy is on his way to Billings. The truth is out. You're just fighting a ghost." Sterling laughed. It was a high, thin sound. "The truth is what I say it is, Thorne. I own the bank. I own the stores. I own the very ground you're standing on." He waved his hand. "Burn it. Burn it all." The riders spurred their horses. They came in fast. Torches went up. I fired. I didn't aim for the men. I aimed for the torches. I hit one. It exploded in a shower of sparks, but there were too many. I heard a window break in the back. Hannah's shotgun roared. A heavy thumping sound. Someone screamed. The house started to fill with smoke. It was a thin, acrid smell. It was the smell of my nightmares. It was the smell of 1870. My vision started to blur. My hands started to shake. "Silas!" Hannah screamed. I looked back. A torch had landed in the kitchen. The curtains were catching. The orange flames were climbing the wood. Abby was huddled in the corner. She wasn't crying. She was just watching the fire. Her eyes were huge. "Abby, look at me," I shouted. I dropped the rifle and ran to the buckets. Every person has a right to be safe in their own home. This fire is a lie. It's a lie meant to make us small, but we are bigger than the fire. I threw the water. The flames hissed. I grabbed the heavy rug and started beating at the walls. I worked like a madman. I wasn't just fighting fire. I was fighting the last 8 years. Hannah came in. She helped me. We fought that fire back. We beat it down until it was just a smoking ruin on the floorboards. But outside, the horses were still circling. Then, I heard something else. It wasn't a horse. It was a rumble, like a distant storm. I went to the window. I looked out toward the road. I saw them. It wasn't a marshal's posse. It was the town. 20 wagons, 30 men on horseback. I saw Hargrove from the general store. I saw Mrs. Vance I even saw Agnes Moore sitting in the front of a buckboard, her gnarled hands holding a rifle. In the lead was Tom Birch, and he wasn't alone. He had a man tied to the horse beside him, a man with a ragged coat and a face full of whiskey veins. Dale Sutton. The townspeople didn't stop at the gate. They rode right through it. They surrounded Sterling and his men. They didn't fire. They just stood there, a wall of honest faces. Sterling's men stopped. They looked at the townspeople. They looked at the 20 rifles pointed at their chests. They looked at Sterling. "What is this?" Sterling shrieked. "Hargrove, get back to your shop. Birch, arrest these people. They're trespassing." Tom Birch rode forward. He looked older. He looked like a man who'd finally found his own skin. "It's over, Thatcher," Birch said. He held up a piece of paper. "I found Sutton. He talked. He talked a lot. He told me about the fire. He told me about James Miller. He told me about the notes you held over my father." Birch looked at the townspeople. "Listen to me. Every citizen has a right to an honest government. We've lived in fear because we thought we were the only ones who saw the rot. But when one person stands up, the darkness loses its power. Equality means that Thatcher Sterling's gold doesn't make him a king. It means he is a man, and he is subject to the same justice as any of us." Hargrove stepped forward. "We're done, Sterling. We're done paying for your protection. We're done looking the other way. We have a right to a town that isn't a cage." Sterling looked around. He saw the faces of the people he'd bullied. He saw the people he'd cheated. He saw that the fear was gone, and a man like Sterling is nothing without fear. He tried to turn his horse. He tried to ride through the line, but Agnes Moore didn't move her buckboard. She blocked his path. "I've waited 8 years for this, Thatcher," Agnes said. Her voice was thin, but it was clear as a bell. "I have a right to see you in a cell before I meet my William." Sterling's men dropped their torches. They raised their hands. They were hired guns. They didn't get paid enough to fight a whole town. I stepped out onto the porch. My face was black with soot. My lungs felt like they were full of needles. But I stood straight. I walked down the steps. I walked right up to Thatcher Sterling. He looked at me. He was trembling. Not from the cold, from the realization that he was small. I reached up and pulled the star out of my vest. I pinned it to the outside of my coat. It was tarnished, but it caught the morning sun. "Thatcher Sterling," I said, "justice is a human right that cannot be bought or sold. Every person in this valley has a right to the truth. You've spent 20 years trying to bury it. But the truth is a living thing, and today it's going to speak for all the people you tried to silence." I took the reins of his horse. "Tom," I said to Birch, "take him to the jail, not the one he owns, the one in Billings. The territorial marshal will be there tomorrow." Birch nodded. "Yes, Marshal Thorne." The townspeople cheered. It wasn't a loud, rowdy cheer. It was a deep, satisfying sound, like a collective breath that had been held for a decade. I watched them lead him away. I watched the wagons follow. I watched the dust settle on the road. Hannah came out onto the porch. She had Abby by the hand. They looked at the yard. They looked at the smoking hay. "Is it finished, Silas?" Hannah asked. "The fighting is," I said, "but the rebuilding is just starting. Every human being has a right to a second chance, Hannah. This town has to find out who it is without Sterling, and I have to find out who I am without the secret." I looked at the locket around her neck. Honesty is a debt that must be paid in full, I thought. And today, we finally settled the account. I walked back to the porch. I sat down on the steps. My knees finally gave out. Abigail came over and sat beside me. She handed me a cracker. "You did good, Cowboy," she said. "No, Abby?" I said. We did good. Every person has a right to stand up. I just helped with the first step. The sun was fully up now. It was a bright, cold day. The snow was sparkling like diamonds. I breathed in. The air was clean. Human dignity is the only treasure worth guarding, I thought. And it's the only one that lasts. The secret was gone. The cowboy was home. And for the first time in 8 years, I wasn't afraid of the dawn. The, the spring in Montana doesn't come with a whisper. It comes with a roar. The ice on the creek cracks like a rifle shot. The snow turns to slush, then to mud, then to the greenest grass you've ever seen. It's a messy, loud, beautiful thing. It's a rebirth. It had been 4 months since the morning Sterling was led away. The trial in Billings had been short. Dale Sutton had talked. The records in the bank had talked. Even the people of Redemption Creek had talked. Thatcher Sterling was gone. He was in a prison cell, waiting for a life sentence. His empire had crumbled, and the land he'd stolen was being returned, piece by piece, to the people who'd bled for it. I was at my own ranch that morning, the Thorne place. I was standing in the hallway. I was looking at a door, the nursery. I hadn't opened it in 8 years. I'd kept it locked. I'd kept it like a tomb. I thought that by keeping it shut, I was protecting Eliza Jane. I thought I was keeping her memory safe. But I was wrong. Every human being has a right to move forward, Silas, I said to the empty hallway. Holding on to the past until it chokes you isn't an act of love. It's an act of fear. You have a right to heal. You have a right to let the light back into the rooms you've kept dark. I reached out. I turned the key. It was rusty. It resisted, but it turned. I pushed the door open. The air inside was stale. It smelled of dust and old dreams. I saw the crib I'd built. I saw the rocking chair I'd painted white. I saw the small, hand-sewn blankets Eliza had made. I didn't cry, not this time. I walked to the window. I pushed it open. The spring air rushed in. It smelled of damp earth and pine. I spent the afternoon cleaning. I dusted the wood. I washed the windows. I didn't throw anything away. I just made it ready. Respecting the dead means living a life they'd be proud of, I thought. It doesn't mean stopping your own heart. Every person has a right to be remembered, but they also have a right to be the foundation for something new. I finished the room. It looked bright. It looked peaceful. It didn't look like a tomb anymore. It looked like a room waiting for a life. I walked out of the house. I climbed onto Silas. We headed toward the Miller Ranch. The trail was green now. The wild flowers were starting to poke through the mud. I saw the Miller place in the distance. The roof I'd fixed was solid. The fence was straight. The garden Hannah had planted was already starting to show. I saw Abby in the corral. She was on the small mare I'd given her for her birthday. She was riding with a confidence that made my chest swell. "Silas," she shouted, waving her hat. "Keep your eyes on the ears, Abby," I called back. Hannah came out onto the porch. She was wearing a dress the color of the sky. She looked young. She looked like the woman James Miller had loved. She looked like a woman who wasn't afraid of the horizon. I dismounted. I walked up to the porch. "You're late for dinner," Hannah said. There was a twinkle in her eyes. "The nursery was dusty," I said. Hannah stopped. She looked at me. She knew what that meant. She reached out and took my hand. "Is it ready?" she asked. "It's ready," I said. We sat on the porch together. We watched Abby ride. We watched the shadows of the clouds move across the valley. "Tom Birch is doing a good job," Hannah said. "The town feels different, Silas. People are talking to each other again. They're building things. They're helping each other." "That's how it's supposed to be," I said. "Every community has a right to be built on trust. When you take away the fear, you leave room for empathy. And empathy is the only thing that makes a territory into a home. Equality means we all have a stake in each other's success. If your neighbor's barn is empty, your own barn isn't truly full. Hannah leaned her head on my shoulder. I think about James every day, but I don't think about the accident anymore. I think about the man who kept a secret in a cigar box just to keep us safe. He was a good man, Hannah, I said. Every person has a right to be remembered for their character, not their tragedy. James Miller was a protector, and he won. He kept you safe until the truth could catch up. I reached into my pocket. I pulled out the locket. I think this belongs to someone else now, I said. I called Abby over. She hopped off the mare and ran to the porch. What is it, Silas? I held out the locket. The gold heart sparkled in the sun. This was Eliza Jane's, I said. She was a brave woman. She loved the truth more than she loved her own safety, and she loved me enough to make sure I found my way back. I looked at Abby. You have a right to a legacy, Abby. A legacy of strength and honesty. This locket isn't just gold. It's a reminder that the truth always finds its way home. I want you to wear it. I want you to remember that you are a daughter of Redemption Creek. And that means you don't ever have to be afraid of the dark. I put the chain around her neck. She looked down at the heart. She looked up at me. I'll keep it safe, Silas, she said. I know you will a little bit. She ran back to her horse. She looked like a spark of light moving across the grass. Hannah and I stood up. We walked to the edge of the porch. Silas Thorne, Hannah said. Are you going to stay? I looked out at the valley. I looked at the straight fences. I looked at the woman beside me. Every man has a right to a home, Hannah, I said. And I've spent 8 years wandering in the cold. I think I've found the one place where the wind doesn't bite so hard. I leaned down. I kissed her. It was a slow, honest kiss. It was a promise. Compassion is the only currency that matters, I thought. And I'm a rich man today. We went inside. The smell of fresh bread and beef stew filled the kitchen. It was the smell of a life. I looked at the star on the table. I hadn't worn it since the trial. I didn't need to. I knew who I was. Justice isn't a badge, I thought. It's a way of living. It's the way you treat your neighbors. It's the way you protect the children. It's the way you tell the truth, even when your voice shakes. The cowboy had a secret, but the man had a family. And as the sun set over the Montana Territory, I knew that the truth wasn't a burden anymore. It was the very air I breathed. Honesty is the only foundation worth building on, I whispered to the quiet house. And we're going to build something that lasts. I pulled a chair out for Hannah. The winter was gone. The spring was here, and the cowboy was home. Every human being has a right to peace, I thought as I sat down. And for the first time in my life, I truly believed it. The story you are about to read is entirely fictional. While it may draw inspiration from universal human experiences, it does not depict real people or actual events. Any perceived parallels are coincidental and should not be interpreted as deliberate representations.
In the end, this story is not only about a cowboy, a widow, a sick child, or a secret hidden inside an old gold locket. It is about the quiet battles that happen in every human heart. Silas Thorne had spent years believing he was a broken man, buried beneath guilt, grief, and silence. Hannah Miller had nearly lost everything, yet she was still willing to sacrifice her last precious memory to save her daughter. Little Abby, weak with fever, became the living reminder that innocence must be protected at any cost. And through them, we learn that compassion is never a small act. A single moment of kindness can open a door that fear has kept closed for years. A hand extended to someone in need can bring truth back into the light. A heart that chooses mercy can become stronger than greed, stronger than cruelty, and stronger than the coldest winter. The lesson of Redemption Creek is that no one survives the hard seasons of life alone. Gold can buy land, banks can write contracts, and powerful men can build walls of lies. But none of those things are greater than human dignity. The real measure of a person is not how much they own, but how they treat those who have nothing left to give. Silas did not find his strength by chasing revenge alone. He found it by caring for Hannah and Abby. Hannah did not lose her dignity when she sold the locket. She proved the deepest kind of honor a mother can carry. And Abby's survival reminds us that every child deserves warmth, safety, truth, and a future untouched by the greed of others. This story teaches us that truth may be buried, but it does not die. It waits. It waits in old letters, in forgotten memories, in the courage of witnesses, and in the hearts of people who refuse to remain silent. Justice is not only about punishing the wicked, it is about protecting the innocent, restoring dignity to the wounded, and giving people back the right to live without fear. Silas's journey reminds us that even after years of pain, a person can rise again. Even a heart that has been frozen by grief can burn with purpose when it chooses to stand for someone else. So when you leave this story, remember this: compassion is a frontier of its own. Every day we are given chances to protect, forgive, speak the truth, and help someone through the storm. We may not carry a marshal's badge or ride through the snow with a Winchester in hand, but we all face moments when silence is easier than courage. And in those moments, the choice we make defines who we are. Redemption. Creek reminds us that kindness is not weakness, love is not helpless, and truth is never wasted. As long as there are people willing to stand together, no darkness can own the land forever.